Welcome. Thank you so much for coming to the second in a series of monthly webinars to delve into the fascinating science of sleep. If we haven't met before, I am based in Hayling Island, and I guess my main efforts in terms of protecting my own mental health and sleep are probably rowing and outrigger canoeing. But I spend a lot of my time as a sleep scientist delivering talks either online or in person, very often to big companies. And I know that I don't often get a chance to interact with the general public. And so this year I kind of set myself a bit of a challenge to try and convey a bit of sleep science in digestible nuggets. So I've been posting a webinar each week on Instagram. There's a fortnightly newsletter. And then once a month, we'll delve into a little bit more detail on one of these webinars, just 40 minutes on a Tuesday evening. The next one is actually on the 26th of March, which is just before the clock change, if you want to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. But in the first webinar, which was all about sleep and self-control, at the very end of the session, I asked people what topics they were most interested in, and sleep and mental health was an overwhelming favourite. It's also a real kind of favourite and interest for me, and something that I've done quite a lot of research on. So I'm really excited about talking about this topic. It is a massive topic, and I'm very conscious that there's lots of different ways that we could navigate it, and I've actually rewritten this presentation several times, but I am going to try and give you a sense in the main body of the presentation about just how and why sleep and mental health are so connected, because we kind of know intuitively that they are, but there are lots of really good reasons for that. And I'll also give you some evidence-based treatment approaches for improving sleep and mental health. I'll highlight a few resources, and my goal is that we get through all of this in half an hour so that we have 10 minutes for your questions. So do please keep a pen and paper handy. If I see questions that are relevant in the chat as I go through, I'll try and pick them up, but most we'll sort of save those at the end. So sleep and mental health, huge topic, huge amounts actually of overlap. So if we start with insomnia, which is kind of the classic sleep disorder, the most common sleep disorder, probably affects at least 10% of the population. During COVID, possibly increased to around about 30%. But this is defined as a difficulty falling asleep or staying asleep or waking up feeling unrefreshed for at least 3 nights a week for 3 months or more, that has a negative impact on daytime function. So if you are not sleeping because you have very small children, this is not necessarily insomnia. That's kind of parenting, but you can be a parent and have insomnia at the same time. But when we come and think about mental health and mental ill health in particular, the most common mental health disorders are anxiety and depression. And I'm going to focus predominantly on those, but a lot of what I'm going to say is actually relevant to a whole much wider range of mental health disorders. And I've put this in a kind of Venn diagram because there is so much overlap. So more than 2/3 of those people who experience insomnia will also suffer from anxiety and or depression. And probably around about 80% of those people with anxiety or depression will also experience disrupted sleep. In fact, when you look at a kind of symptom checklist for those conditions, disrupted sleep, in the case of depression, either too much sleep or too little sleep, is a very typical part of those clinical presentations. And as I just mentioned, it's not just those mental health disorders alone. Pretty much think of any psychiatric condition, and there is a very high comorbidity with insomnia. And I think this is really important to point out, because I know some people who join the call that perhaps mental health first aiders. I interacted with a guy called Andy earlier this week who said he's a mental health first aider. And I think if you're approaching supporting somebody with any kind of mental health condition, the chances are that they probably have poor sleep as well. So that's kind of on a macro level. But actually, from day to day, most of us know that how we sleep influences our mood and vice versa. And this is data from just one study that looked at kind of 200 young people, and they tracked their sleep and they also tracked their mood on a day-to-day basis over 2 weeks. What they found was that the negative emotions of anxiety and sadness typically led to a worse sleep quality that evening, whereas feeling happy, confident, calm led to better quality sleep, and crucially, vice versa. So this is a two-way relationship. And actually, there was a huge study that reviewed 50 years worth of research that was published late last year. That kind of the overall conclusion was, if you are sleep deprived, you are going to wake up less happy and more anxious on average. So that's kind of pretty clear. This anxiety is not just about the way that you think and feel, it also influences your behavior. So this is data that was taken from a study that was done by Matthew Walker's group. And they took some healthy human volunteers and they deprived them of sleep for an entire night. And you can see that the morning after their sleep deprivation, there was an increase in anxiety. Actually, anxiety increased by 30%, with people kind of reaching clinical levels of anxiety the morning after their day of sleep deprivation. But what also happened, they did quite an interesting study where they got the volunteers to kind of stand up, and then one of the researchers started walking towards them, and they got them to raise their hand when they felt that this other person was invading their personal space. And what they found was that when we're sleep deprived, we tend to be less comfortable with people approaching us. We're actually more likely to retreat from social situations, and we have a kind of increased sense of anxiety, not just about our general worries, but also about being around other people. So very clearly that can influence the way that we react with other people. And I've got a quick test here to see how sleep deprived you are today. That's for last night. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to flash up 6 faces onto the screen. And if you've been to any of my webinars before, you might have tried this exercise. But 6 faces. What I want to know is how many of them look angry or hostile. Okay, and I'd like you to put your answer into the chat. Okay, so here we go. That's it. That's all you get. How many of those faces do you think looked angry? Stephen reckons 2, Andy 1, Denise 3. Okay, good distribution. Lovely. So there were, in fact, according to the researchers, 2 angry faces. But it turns out that if we are sleep deprived, Hannah, I think you might be a little bit sleep deprived, possibly. You're more likely to interpret neutral faces as threatening. You can just think about that for a moment. That's going to influence everything about your day. When you come down to breakfast in the morning, when you sit on a Zoom call and you see someone's slightly blank face, your brain is more likely to interpret that facial expression as being threatening. And this is all linked to what happens in the brain when we are sleep deprived. So when we haven't slept well for a period of time, or we've had severe sleep deprivation, what happens is that the part of our brain that senses threat, the amygdala, becomes more sensitive. And what that means is that we are more likely to switch on that fight or flight stress response. At the same time, and we mentioned this in the last session, the prefrontal cortex, which is the part of your brain which is very logical, very rational, actually becomes depowered. It receives less glucose when we're short of sleep. The brain effectively prioritizes this sense of survival because it feels like it's under threat, and it downregulates all of these kind of logical, rational, strategic, self-control type functions. And when it comes to managing your emotions, that means that we become much more vulnerable to this whole array of mental health disorders, whether that's just perceiving that we're more overwhelmed, we're more stressed, struggling to empathize with others, increased anxiety, depression, or even burnout. And I'm going to focus a little bit more on anxiety because the links are just so clear and so strong. So what is thought to actually happen in anxiety disorder, which is really an excessive amount of worry that starts interfering with day-to-day function, is that our brains, everybody's brains, are constantly kind of scanning our environment using our senses, sight, sound, and smell, to sense danger. And those inputs are kind of processed in this part of the brain called the thalamus. And usually the thalamus checks in with the much larger cortex, for example, the visual cortex, but actually the whole of the wider range of the brain. And it sort of checks in and says, look, is that thing that we are seeing, smelling, or hearing, is that dangerous? And the cortex goes through this kind of sense checking, memory checking function, and then it comes back to the thalamus and lets the thalamus know whether or not to activate the amygdala and let the stress response kind of let rip. But it's thought that in anxiety disorder, we effectively have a bit of a shortcut. And because the brain sort of trains itself to be in this hyper sort of sense of arousal, hyper threat, hypersensitivity, we bypass this checking system in the cortex. And actually, if there's any kind of sense of threat, it just activates the amygdala. We have like this trigger happy amygdala. So you can kind of see how lack of sleep and anxiety just compound each other's effects. Now, when we talk about the cause of any mental health condition, it's always multifactorial, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but there are lots of factors: genetics, environmental risk factors, including early childhood, poverty, traumatic events. But usually those things are then combined with your environment, any kind of stressor. We have protective effects from things like social support, but this whole gamut of factors influences whether or not we actually develop anxiety. So lack of sleep can amplify, basically supersize the influence of stress, but it can also get in the way of some of those protective factors, such as seeking support. So you can see very clearly how lack of sleep could amplify the effects of anxiety and interfere with effective treatment, which we'll kind of go on to talk about. I'm not going to delve a lot more into the kind of neuroscience of what also goes on in sleep loss. I mean, we could get pretty detailed, but I think at a macro level, it's just quite helpful to think about that sense of hyperarousal. But certainly, sleep has functions, anti-inflammatory effects. It helps with the moderation of various neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. There's certainly a role of genetics in there as well. And what we also know is that it's not just lack of sleep, but it's also disruption to the regularity of your sleep patterns that influences the risk of these mental health disorders. So messing up that circadian clock that we talked a little bit about last time. But the overall impact of lack of sleep, of poor mental health, is typically this state of hyperarousal. So sometimes it starts with poor sleep, sometimes it starts with stress and emotional dysregulation. But what we get is this kind of dysregulated stress response, overexposure to stress hormones. And in the case of insomnia, it's very often the way that we respond to that sleep loss that ends up kind of perpetuating the problem. So because we are tired, we reach for fast food or we reach for alcohol to try and calm us down, which actually disrupts sleep further. So then we reach for caffeine as a stimulant, and these things just kind of compound the problem. One of the impacts of stress and hyperarousal on the brain is that your brain has been trained to focus on the source of stress. Now, in the case of a long-term sleep problem, it's very common for you to start seeing sleep as the threat, as the enemy, and you can start to develop some quite unhelpful thoughts about sleep. I'm going to talk about how we manage those in a moment. But for example, tomorrow's going to be a disaster. I'm never going to be able to sleep. If I can't sleep, I'm going to get dementia, diabetes. These are the kind of thoughts which plague us when we are awake at night. So that's a little bit of a map of some of the ways that sleep and mental health interact. I'm going to kind of move on a little bit into how we actually treat these problems, how we improve mental health and sleep. So if we, again, take a bit of a bird's eye view, when you look at the evidence-based treatment for both insomnia and mental health disorders, the mainstay, the usual kind of first line recommended approach is psychological therapies, talking therapies, usually based around cognitive behavioral therapy. So cognitive therapies to address the unhelpful thoughts, behavioral therapies to kind of reset natural sleep patterns or behaviors, often supported by medication and with a really important role for lifestyle. Now, you might have joined the call because you have a clinical level condition, or actually you just feel a bit low, lacking in energy, maybe don't always have the perfect sleep. So I want to start with some of the approaches, the lifestyle approaches that are relevant for everybody, no matter whether or not you have a clinical condition. And there was a study that tried to summarize all the different ways that individuals can improve their mental health. And this was published back in 2009, I think, but actually is still really relevant today. It was produced by something called the New Economics Foundation, but since then there's a charity called Action for Happiness, which has kind of taken on these recommendations. But you may well have come across these before. The ultimate output was something called the 5 Ways to Wellbeing. And the idea was that these are things that every individual, no matter how much money they have or how much free time, these are things that everybody could do to improve their mental health. So connecting with other people, physical activity, taking moments to be mindful and focus on the present, or perhaps practice meditation, giving their time or giving kind of their effort and their expertise to the community, and also learning, that kind of idea of lifelong learning and developing mastery over something. So these 5 ways to well-being were thought to be pretty kind of fundamental things that can make people more resilient and also improve happiness. And I remember when I first saw this list and I kind of thought, oh, well, it's not surprising that lack of sleep interferes with mental health, because actually there is evidence that lack of sleep interferes with every single one of those ways to well-being. So as we mentioned at the beginning, when you're short of sleep, you're much less likely to want to interact with other people. You're actually more prone to conflict. You find it harder to empathize. You have less energy for getting to the gym. If you've ever tried to meditate and found it very, very difficult, please don't be surprised. It's not just you. Actually, we also know that when you're short of sleep, it's harder to sit there and meditate. Your brain is a little bit more kind of active. And we tend to see that people are more prone to what's called cyberloafing. So they struggle to concentrate at work and they spend more time on looking at cats on YouTube and things like that. There's also evidence that the day after daylight savings time, people become less likely to give to charity. So we're actually less likely to kind of be generous to other people. And we also struggle to learn when we're short of sleep. That kind of working memory center, the hippocampus of the brain, gets filled up during the day, and usually sleep is the process through which we consolidate memories and free up more capacity in the hippocampus. But if you're not sleeping well, that's not going to happen. So all of these potential levers of better mental health are impaired when you are short of sleep. And I think that kind of is part of the reason that insomnia is one of the real obstacles to effective treatment and management of poor mental health. So I've got some data here specifically looking at suicidal ideation. I think it's important to kind of flag this up, that actually insomnia is associated with double the risk of suicidal ideation. And sleep problems outperform depression and hopelessness as predictors of suicide. I mean, it's an independent risk factor. So again, for those of you who are mental health first aiders, just keeping that in the back of your mind that, poor sleep is not just something trivial. And actually, ever since sort of 2013, DSM-5, which is this kind of the encyclopedia of mental health disorders, has given the recommendation that insomnia should be treated regardless of whatever else is going on in someone else's life. Insomnia is a really important aspect of both physical and mental health. And that's a completely different way of looking at things. Because 20 years ago, if you'd gone to your doctor with poor sleep, very often they made the assumption that it was because you were depressed or anxious. And very often people would walk out of the doctor's surgery with an antidepressant or an anxiolytic drug. But we now know that actually poor sleep at least doubles the risk of a future mental health disorder, which sounds kind of bad until you flip that on its head and look at the positive. And the positive here is that better sleep is a really malleable lever when it comes to improving mental health. And this is where I get quite excited. One of the very first research studies that I was involved with in sleep, I was working for a company called Sleepio that has an online sleep improvement program. It's online CBT. And we worked with a mental health service, an IAPT service, improving access to psychological therapies. And there were lots of people on the waiting list who were not being treated for anxiety or depression. So we said, well, look, while they're waiting, how about we give them this online program to improve their sleep? Now, it only targeted sleep. There was no therapy in there that was directly directed towards mental health. And yet, over the course of 6 weeks, what we actually got was significant improvements in depression and anxiety as sleep efficiency, the proportion of time in bed, actually improved. Now, that was just in 100 NHS patients, and it was followed by a much larger trial in thousands of students that actually found something very similar. And so that is now one of many studies, I think 65 trials, which have looked at improving sleep as a lever for improving mental health. And they've found improvements across depression, anxiety, even psychosis symptoms. The more you improve sleep, the more mental health will improve. So for me, this is a really good reason to focus on sleep. So how do you do it? Well, the basics most people are aware of. And if you've been onto my website, there's a little quiz on there which will tell you, which of these levers you might want to use. But it's about reinforcing your body clocks and managing your sleep pressure, and also trying to manage that stress response so that you can relax and unwind before bed. But if you suffer from insomnia, these things may well not be enough, because you've also got to manage some of those unhelpful thoughts. So the approach that is recommended for insomnia is something called cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm going to give you a very quick rundown of some of the ingredients. I'm hoping that actually in a later session we can go into a little bit more detail, but I will talk a little bit about cognitive reframing, because I think that's really helpful whether we're talking about poor sleep or poor mental health. So what are the key kind of tools within this CBT for insomnia toolkit? Firstly, using a sleep diary to monitor your sleep habits. There was one that I sent out in a pack after the last webinar. This is just really helpful for improving people's awareness about what's actually going on, because we often convince ourselves that our sleep is terrible, but actually when we start to track it every day, we realize it's maybe not every night of the week that you're not sleeping well. It's maybe only 2, 3, 4 nights a week. And as soon as you start to track it, then you start to be able to learn what works and what actually improves things. Getting up at the same time every day, no matter how much time you've been asleep, that's about reinforcing, strengthening circadian rhythms. Taking time out to relax at intervals during the day rather than just going through your day at 300 miles an hour. A lot of people are guilty of just being busy It's not your fault, but it means that you are constantly on all day long. If you don't give yourself a chance to switch off, your brain, your body runs on adrenaline and cortisol. And adrenaline and cortisol are the real enemy to melatonin, the hormone that helps to signpost sleep and a restful sleep. So the more you can rehearse pausing that stress response during the day, the more likely you are to be able to ease into a restful sleep at night. And then creating a positive bed sleep connection. This is about just using your bed for sleep and for sex and for nothing else. And if you can't sleep, if you're lying there getting frustrated, then get out of bed. Go somewhere else in your home, read a book, watch a film, listen to music, do some mindfulness, anything that just distracts you from trying too hard to sleep. And then when you're tired, get back into bed. There's another tool called sleep restriction therapy, which I'll go through when we talk about insomnia. And then the final thing is kind of cognitive reframing. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you have had the experience of lying there plagued by these unhelpful thoughts that I mentioned, you may well be aware that these thoughts do not appear in a vacuum. They are attached to emotions and physical sensations, because when you lie there thinking, oh my God, tomorrow's going to be a disaster, that emotional feeling of either frustration or anxiety switches on the fight or flight stress response. So we start to feel tense, our heart rate increases, we maybe sweat, body temperature increases. It's the exact opposite of what you need to get into a restful sleep. And so it's very natural to respond by kind of wriggling around. Maybe you stare at the clock, which makes you feel even worse and just reinforces these negative thoughts. So, in both depression, anxiety, insomnia, very often we can get trapped in this kind of catastrophic black and white mode of thinking. And cognitive reframing, if I was to put it in a nutshell, it's just about noticing your thoughts and responding as if you were your best friend. So you might have a thought that, tomorrow's going to be a disaster, but actually your friend goes, is it though? Is it really going to be a disaster? You know what? You've had bad sleep for a couple of months now, and actually you've managed to get through every day. So let's not over catastrophize on that one. Very often, as I've said, people start to see poor sleep as the enemy. They start to kind of blame it for anything that's gone on. And just reminding yourself that actually everybody has the odd poor night of sleep. You can still have a good day even after a bad night of sleep. There are lots of things that will influence how your day goes. And if you ever perhaps lie there staring at your partner who's perhaps snoring softly beside you, just remind yourself that everybody has different sleep needs. We all actually wake up at intervals during the night. You might have seen this before. It's a hypnogram. We sleep in cycles, and it's really normal to have a couple of brief periods of wakefulness in between cycles. So the first thing you want to tell yourself is, yeah, do you know what? This is a normal part of sleep. I don't need to despair right now, because as soon as you start to flip those thoughts into a more kind of positive frame of mind, then it's much easier to develop positive emotions, which help you to flip from fight or flight into the rest or digest mode. And that means that you're in a good place to just perhaps do some slow breathing. Progressive muscle relaxation is a great exercise where you tense the muscles in your body gradually, perhaps starting in your toes, tense them for 5, and then relax, and then move through the body. And after the webinar, actually, I'll share a short audio 5-minute kind of progressive muscle relaxation technique that you can use. You can practice during the day and practice in the evening. So this cognitive reframing thing, it's probably best done either in a spoken way with somebody else, as a kind of therapist, or it's really effective actually if you just write things down. Getting into the habit, perhaps setting a timer every day of writing in a journal. And in anxiety is very often called worry time. You can call it whatever you like. It's a kind of a bit of you time. It's just to write down from the top of your head, what is the stuff that you're worrying about? And once it's down there on the page, you can start to work through it and go, okay, Which of these are out of my control? Because if it's out of your control, you can just put a line through it. And you might write it down every day, but after a while, you'll start to kind of almost check yourself before you have the thought and go, that's out of my control. I'm not going to bother worrying about that. But the stuff that you're worrying about that you can do something about, that's when you kind of make an action plan. Decide on one small action that you're going to do to decrease that worry. And then I would genuinely recommend that if you do this exercise, you finish up with a couple of things that you're grateful for. Always try and rehearse the positive in addition to focusing on that negative. So this kind of cognitive reframing can be so helpful across poor sleep, poor mental health, but I do also know that it's not necessarily for everyone. If you found this on Instagram, you'll have seen that I also talked about a study that came out last week that suggests that actually physical activity is something which is just as powerful as a means for improving mental health as actually serotonin selective reuptake inhibitors, the most widely used antidepressants. And actually, CBT and physical activity are similarly effective. Now, everybody is different, and it may well be that physical activity is kind of more useful when you're kind of on the up, not when you're in an acute crisis, for example. But actually, in general, focusing on physical activity is another way to get your thoughts under control, to help you manage the stress response. I also just want to share one more thing, and we'll come on to questions, which is that even if you can't move your body, just getting outside is likely to have a very positive impact on both your sleep and your mental health. There was this study from the UK Biobank which looked at over 500,000 UK adults, and they got them to measure sort of how much time they spent outside, and on average it was 2.5 hours. But for every additional hour spent outdoors during the day, there was a significant decrease in the odds of lifetime depression, antidepressant use, an improvement in happiness, and an improvement in sleep, a reduction in tiredness, and people found it easier to get up in the morning. Lots of reasons for this. It helps to kind of reset your circadian rhythms when you spend time outdoors, and probably also associated with some of the benefits of physical activity. So I'm going to kind of wrap up the presentation there. I also wanted to just share a few resources with you, which you may or may not be aware of, but there's some great books on the topics of sort of sleep and mental health. There's a charity called the Sleep Charity that also has some really useful resources, and some of my favorite podcasts I've just listed here, and please do feel free to share your own. There are some really good ones. But has this inspired any questions in your mind? I would love to hear from you if this sounds interesting, familiar. If you joined for a particular reason with a particular question in your mind, please do share it. You can either unmute or just ask the question in the chat. Be absolutely fine. And while you do that, I'm gonna launch a poll as well for our next webinar. Denise says, I've just, by the way, launched a poll just to see if there are any topics you're particularly interested in next time. What about getting sunlight in winter? Yes, Denise, this is extremely difficult. And as it happens, I actually have with me, I'm not sure if I plugged it in. Yes, I did. So for those of you who are thinking, yeah, I'd love to get more sunlight in winter, well, what you can do is use a SAD lamp, a seasonal affective disorder lamp. Now, this is something which has been designed so that it emits a similar intensity of light to sunlight, so around about 10,000 lux. And all you do is you sit with this on your breakfast table for about half an hour every morning, and in particular in areas of the northern hemisphere, southern hemisphere, where you don't get enough natural light during the day to reset your circadian rhythms and send a strong signal to your brain that it's daytime. Actually, use of light therapy has been found to be helpful not just for seasonal affective disorder, which is a seasonal winter type of depression, but also for major depressive disorder. So I think particularly supplementing the CBT type approaches, using light therapy can be really helpful for, again, improving mood and also improving sleep. I hope that helps. You can pick one of these up, by the way, for about kind of £50 or so from John Lewis. If you look for one that has a CE mark, hopefully that means it will do what it says on the tin. Hannah says, I wake up feeling really anxious, almost panic-stricken every morning, and I don't know why. Have you heard of this? Is it connected to sleep? Thanks, Hannah, for sharing that. That is really rough. And it is actually really quite common. And if you have had quite fragmented sleep or short sleep, as we saw at the beginning, you are going to be more prone to this slightly overactive amygdala as my brain. Okay, so the amygdala is the thing that switches on your fight or flight stress response. It's the thing that senses fear. Now, it turns out that when we wake up in the morning, it's usually our amygdala that wakes up first, particularly if you've been quite anxious. But this logical, rational prefrontal cortex is often a bit slower to come back online. It might take you 10, 20 minutes, even half an hour before your prefrontal cortex is really fully charged for the day. And if you suffer from groggy kind of sleep inertia, it might take even longer. So it's really natural in the middle of the night when people wake up, they start having these very anxious, intense thoughts because this rational bit of their brain is simply not quite woken up yet. So part of the solution is just giving it time. It's recognizing that anxiety. And if you possibly can, taking some long, slow breaths. Because when you're feeling very anxious, what tends to happen is we breathe in a very shallow way, which reinforces to your brain that we are in some kind of crisis mode. Because if you were running from a saber-toothed tiger, you'd either be panting or freezing in fear. But if you can slow your breath down, that's one of the quickest ways of sending a message to the brain that actually you're safe, you're in control, and it's okay to just sort of be there without panicking. I hope that helps, Hannah. So a few sort of slow breaths. Let me see. Keith says, how do I reset my body clock? Last night I went to sleep at 7 a.m.-ish and woke up at 4 p.m. Okay, right. So Keith, we've got a major reset to do here. Now, in terms of resetting your body clocks, it probably only happens by about an hour every 24 hours. This is why people get jet lag, and this is why night shifts are such a pain for the body. So you've got to be patient, but effectively, I would be looking at gradually changing by only an hour or 2 hours every day. You can change just through behavioral means, but actually when you're out of sync with your body clocks, you're going to stay fatigued until your body clocks have caught up with you. So the ideal thing is shortly kind of after dawn, early in the morning, you want plenty of bright light, you want to move your body, and you want to eat some breakfast. Because those three signals of light, movement, and food are things that tell your brain that it's daytime. So you want loads of those things during daylight hours, and then about 2 hours before bed, you want to be avoiding those things like the plague. You want to dim the lights. You don't want to be doing anything too intensive from an activity perspective, and ideally you want to avoid eating large meals so that you're really sending all the signals to reset your body clocks. I hope that helps, Keith. Peter says, I need to try CBTI. How best to track down a CBTI expert in my area? Peter, there is something called the Insomnia Clinic, which is an online CBTI service. That might be worth checking out. I'm currently recording an online course that might be helpful, but it's not ready yet. So perhaps you'll have to pilot mine when it's ready. By all means, I'm hoping that this group will be something that can kind of test and try out this stuff that I produce. But yeah, maybe try the Insomnia Clinic. You can try your GP. There are some online services in some areas, but it's a little bit of a postcode lottery, unfortunately. Sarah says, would be great if you could share your slides in the sleep diary. Yes, of course. And I'll also send you a link to the recording of the first session. Andy says he's dialed up getting up at the same time 7 days a week, which has had a massive difference in his sleep quality. The simple stuff really works. Andy, thank you so much for sharing that. I think people often think that improving their sleep is complicated, and honestly, with consistency, it can be so simple. Brilliant. Okay, so look, it's 7:40, and I promised everyone I wanted to let you go on time, but let me just share the results of our little poll. Definitely an interest in insomnia and sudden sleep problems. So I think probably when we return on the 26th of March, it will probably be a session focused a little bit more on insomnia, CBTI. Peter, this could be very useful for you. We'll talk about sleep restriction therapy and any bits of CBTI that we haven't already spoken about. Wonderful. Okay, yeah. If you have any more questions, please do keep them coming. I'll sit here for another minute or two. But otherwise, I will leave you to your evening. Thank you so much for coming. Please feel free to ping me questions, thoughts, stuff that we can cover on future occasions. But thank you so much for making the effort to come along.